Thanks for tuning in to tonight's event, sponsored by the Menard Family George Washington Forum here at Ohio University. Tonight's guest is Eugene McCarraher, and he's here to have a conversation with us about capitalism in the modern world. You'll have a chance to ask Gene some questions during the course of the event. In the bottom of your screen, you'll see the Q&A function in Zoom. Pop your question in there, and I will do my very best to address all of them, Gene, in the course of the night. Eugene McCarraher is Professor of Humanities at Villanova University. He earned his PhD in history from Rutgers University, and his first book was Christian Critics, Religion and the Impasse in American Social Thought, which came out in 2000. He contributes regularly to Commonweal, the Hedgehog Review, Raritan, and he's written for Dissent and The Nation. His most recent book, all 800 pages of it, is The Enchantments of Mammon, How Capitalism Became the Religion of Modernity. And we're going to talk about that tonight. So thanks very much for joining us, Gene.
My pleasure.
This is an extraordinary book. It traces, it covers a little period from 1600 to yesterday. And it covers a big theme, capitalism. I just want to talk, it has a very particular tone, right? There's a kind of moral, almost indignation in it. And I just wondered, or moral fervor, let me put it that way. Where does that come from? I mean, why'd you write the book?
Well, first of all, thanks very much for having me here. It's a pleasure and an honor to talk to everyone tonight. I wrote this book out of, I think, three concerns, all of which coalesced in the late 1990s. As I was finishing Christian Critics. The first one had to do with how to negotiate going from writing about religion as a historical subject to enlisting theology and religion as tools of historical scholarship. Throughout the 90s, various religious historians, epitomized by Notre Dame's George Marsden, had written about what they thought was a kind of exclusion from the mainstream of historical writing of religious perspectives on the past. And what Marsden had called for was what he called a seat at the table of historical scholarship. And it seemed to me that while I shared Marsden's sentiments and his hopes, it also seemed to me that religious historians should have something interesting to say once they actually got to the table, something that was interesting and compelling. And it seemed to me that they had to have something more interesting to say than to simply go on about the spiritual dimension of history, which struck me as, abstruse to the point of being vaporous. And I also thought that I also wanted to avoid a certain problem that I can see among certain evangelical historians, which is looking for the hand of providence, right, in history. That's above my pay grade, to look for the hand of God in history. So I simply thought, why don't we think about what human beings are doing in theological terms? In other words, if we think that human beings are the image and likeness of God, what does that mean in terms of how we write about them in the terrestrial realm of history? That was one set of questions. Another had to do with the kind of world that was emerging in the 90s in the wake of communism and what seemed to be at least the apparent final, and it seemed at least irreversible, victory of global capitalism. In other words, the rise of the world that we've now called neoliberalism. One of the things that struck me about this was, there's no other word for it, the eschatological fervor with which a lot of writers such as Francis Fukuyama were writing about this. Fukuyama wrote this book entitled The End of History, and by which I understand that he didn't mean the end of history in discrete events, but as though we've reached this plateau, or we've reached this stage where basically there's no, as Margaret Thatcher put it, there is no alternative now. what struck me about a lot of this was the almost laughably religious rhetoric in which some of this was being conveyed. End of history certainly has that eschatological character to it. And a lot of pundits and politicians were talking like this and writing like this, and not just in religious circles, but in places like The Economist, the New York Times. You see this rhetoric everywhere in the political and the business press. And the third reason that I guess I'd want to mention is that what also impressed me and a lot of other people was not just the victory of business, but the victory of business culture. Just the sort of sheer ubiquitous presence of business vernacular and imagery in advertising and marketing and public relations and in journalism. It was almost as though business was inscribing its commands, right, in the firmament of popular culture everywhere. And some of that imagery, I have to say, was often very beautifully and hauntingly enchanting to look at. I'll give you two examples. One was a Microsoft ad from sometime in the late 90s. And in both of these examples, I have to stress, you never see the product being advertised, right? One is a Microsoft ad in which an older Black woman is sitting on a bench, and she has all these little children running around her in slow motion, and she has her arms extended like the goddess Kali, and I thought this is an odd way to advertise a computer. And the second example is an Infinity ad in which you see a dark, ominous, cloudy background. You see a single bird flying across, and then you see a single word at the end, infinity. Never see the car, right? It's all about atmosphere. It's all about mood. And I began thinking a lot about the religious aura of a lot of this advertising in the late 90s. And I started to put this together with what I was reading and seeing in this eschatological fervor about neoliberalism and the end of history. And I started to wonder if capitalism was beginning to take on the quality of a religion. And if so, how did we get here? And then I started to wonder, has it possibly always been this way? And then it occurred to me that if that's so, then one of the main stories that intellectuals have told themselves about modernity was not true, namely what Max Weber called the disenchantment of the world, or what Charles Taylor, back in 2009 called a secular age. And it just seemed to me that if all of this is true, then maybe that whole story needs to be just jettisoned. Or
yeah, because enchantment's a word appears a lot in disenchantment and misenchantment. These three come together. For people listening who might not be familiar, what's disenchantment and enchantment? I mean, as you understand it.
Well, as I understand it, enchantment and religion is only one form of enchantment. I make this clear in the prologue. Enchantment can take many forms: magic, animism, the occult, alchemy. Religion is probably its most intellectually and ritually sophisticated form. But enchantment basically refers to the idea that the world is somehow suffused or ruled by or watched over by some kind of invisible powers. And it also names the idea that our deepest longings and our most profound values are actually anchored in the universe. They're not simply subjective projections, right, of what we want. That they're really a part of the universe. And the story of disenchantment that we've told ourselves in modernity for the last couple of centuries is this belief that, with the progress of science and with the development of commerce, our belief in these beings has either withered away completely, or it's been sort of sequestered in private belief, right? So, you know, what you do in the laboratory or what you do in the counting house, that's one thing, and so your religious beliefs are over here. And that supposes that, you know, the natural world itself is like inanimate stuff. It's just dumb stuff, which then can be mastered and exploited by human beings. And what I argue in Enchantments is that this is actually, I think this is actually wrong, that money has in fact taken the place of God as a metaphysical and moral arbiter. And I don't mean that simply, you know, in a kind of, oh, people worship money, that this kind of conventional way we usually think about it, as in people are greedy. Well, you know, that's hardly a novel insight, right? But I do think that under capitalism, money really does become a moral and ontological arbiter of what's real. And misenchantment, as opposed to disenchantment, is in a sense what I'm tracing throughout the book. How I think money has this kind of perverse moral and ontological purchase on what we do, and I think it reaches its zenith, or I guess you could say it's nadir in neoliberal capitalism. So I think that, you know, we've been getting to this place in some sense for close to 400 years.
Yeah, so
just the last 40.
So someone asked, sent in a question actually just before the event started. I wanted to get to. So what do you understand religion to be, right? So the person says there's a threshold. It seems in the book, this reader says, that the threshold of what enchantment is simply sort of the presence of religious language, but isn't some of that just figurative? And do you have some kind of substantive definition of religion? And the viewer was saying something like Marx is religious imagery. It's not, Marx isn't trying to offer up an alternative spirituality, but its own kind of materialist. And so just, yeah, your thoughts on what religion is.
I guess so. I guess I'll answer that by way of Marx, because I do think that Marx was actually a keener theologian than even he realized. You know, I agree that Marx is not looking for some kind of alternative spirituality. You know, certainly I don't want to put words in Carl's mouth, right? But I do think that, especially when he's writing about commodity fetishism, and what he calls the power of money, it's very clear that Marx realizes that the role that money is playing in capitalist societies is more than just a medium of exchange, and it's more, it's an actual as I call it, an ontological arbiter. So there's this passage in one of Marx's early writings where he says, you know, money, or he doesn't say this, but I mean, the gloss I put on it is, money becomes this kind of alchemist that's able to, for example, he has this passage where he says, I'm ugly, but because I have money, I can buy myself the most beautiful of women. I'm dumb and stupid, but I can buy myself a great education. And then he says, and he's basing this, in fact, on conventional economic thinking. If I have a vocation for study, but I have no money, I have no vocation for study. In other words, he's taking the standards of economics itself and saying, look, in capitalist society, if you're thirsty and you have no money, your thirst does not exist as a matter of the market. Now, you and I both know that you're still thirsty, but we act as though we're not, because money is what has actually mediated all this. And so my argument is that, look, Marx is actually on the verge of a very, very keen theological insight there. And he even opens, I don't think we think about the significance of this enough. He opens that famous passage on commodity fetishism in Das Kapital by saying the commodities have metaphysical subtleties and theological niceties. Now, everybody thinks he's being sardonic there, and he is to some degree. But I think he's actually, as I said, a keener theologian than even he realizes. He knows that something more is going on in capitalism than simply injustice and exploitation. There's something deeper going on. But because he's committed to this disenchanted or secular rhetoric that he has to use, he can't follow up on that. So in a sense, what I'm doing is following up on that and saying that, you know, what you needed there was a kind of theological language to help explain what's going on.
Okay. So so we have a sense of what enchantment is and disenchantment. So the book, again, it's a hawker of a book, right? Traces the history of capitalism, looking at it as a religious phenomenon almost. So where does capitalism come from? What are its prerequisites? How do you understand it? Is capitalism a Christian heresy? Right? These are, yeah.
I'd certainly say that much of economics is a heresy.
How so?
I'll talk about that first, and then I want to explain
Sure.
what I understand by capitalism. The reason that I think economics is in many ways a kind of a Christian heresy is that I think its foundational ideas are simply wrong. Thomas Carlyle once infamously called economics the dismal science, but I think that John Ruskin in the book actually went in one better and denied that it's a science at all. Ruskin opens one of his great books, Unto This Last, by comparing economics to alchemy and witchcraft and astrology, and says, look, why should I be interested in this science? Or the way he puts it is, I should be interested in this science to exactly the same extent that I should be interested in a science of gymnastics that says that people don't have any skeletons. In other words, I shouldn't be interested in it at all because its foundational principles are simply erroneous. It's not just that they're unedifying, they're erroneous. And the two that in this book I try to hammer at, are the notion of scarcity. I mean, it seems to me that if you are a Christian, and not just a Christian, I mean, you don't have to be a Christian to believe this, that the world is a place of abundance, that which makes generosity not just a nice thing, but it actually makes it something that's goes with the grain of the universe, right? So I think that's a problem. And then there's this kind of economic humanism, where we're all basically a bunch of rational, utility maximizing monads. And I'm sorry, but I think a totally rational, utility maximizing individual is just another term for a sociopath. And I just don't think people are like this. And, you don't have to think that people are angels, to believe that we're more than just these kind of covetous machines that are always seeking our self-interest. And besides, again, if you believe, as I do, that human beings are the image and likeness of God, then that means that you're more than a rational utility maximizer. So I do think that a lot of, at least some of these basic principles are, I guess, heretical is a word that I always am very, I'm loath to use, but, sure, I agree. Now, capitalism, as a form of economics, I guess I'd always start by trying to talk a little bit about what I don't think it is, right? Because I think there are a lot of misconceptions about what comprises it. I don't think that capitalism is just the market. I mean, we've had markets for as long as we've had recorded history, right? But we haven't had capitalism. It's not profit, because merchants and moneylenders have been seeking profit in Rome and medieval Bruges and Renaissance Florence, but they weren't capitalists. I don't think it's just accumulation of wealth, because you've had accumulation of wealth in like Middle Kingdom Egypt, and ancient Athens, and Valois France, for that matter. So, and besides, I don't think there's anything inherently insidious about accumulation of surplus. I mean, I don't see how you could have art and literature and science and culture and civilization unless you had accumulation of some surplus, to some degree. And I also don't think that capitalism is just private property. And I think that that's actually what gets us to what it is. I think that capitalism is this historically unique system of property relations between producers and appropriators. In other words, those who produce and those who control the means of production. So in pre-capitalist societies, I think that masters or overlords used political and military power to basically force producers either to perform surplus labor or to fork over a certain percentage of their produce. Under capitalism, right? Under capitalist property relations, I should be clear. The producers are legally free, right? Unlike chattel slaves or serfs, who are actually entailed to land. The producers are legally free. You can take the job or you can leave it, right? Whatever. So those are the employees or the workers. And they're dispossessed from the means of production, right? In other words, slaves were owned. Serfs and peasants had direct access to the means of production, right? I mean, if you're a serf, you can walk out into the field and start working anytime you want. In capitalism, workers can't just, go to the office of the factory any old time. They have to get access to the means of production. They have to sell their capacity to labor for a wage. And their produce or their surplus labor is not appropriated by any coercive means. I mean, at least overt coercion, as there is in slavery or in feudalism. And so because they're propertyless, right, as I said, producers have to get access to the means of production by selling their capacity to labor. And I think that it's this kind of unique property relationship and these unique kind of relationships between people that are mediated by the market and by money. And that form of mediation imposes all kinds of economic conduct that distinguish capitalism from earlier forms of economic life. The imperatives of competition, profit maximization, reinvestment of surplus, constantly trying to augment labor productivity, and actually systematizing technological innovation as opposed to simply letting it happen kind of haphazardly, as it did before. So I'm always more comfortable defining capitalism in terms of property relations and how they're mediated in terms of the market and money, rather than simply talking about, well, capitalism depends on avarice. Yes, it does, but it's a rationalized kind of avarice. That's how I understand it. I don't. In other words, I guess there's no really kind of simple one sentence definition of capitalism that you can.
It's a complicated thing. Okay, so there's this thing, capitalism, that emerges in America, right? And you have. So I ask you about some various actors to see how they play in your story about that. So you have, the Puritans said we're errand into the wilderness, but you say, well, no, that it's an errand into the marketplace. So the early stage of capitalism in America, what role do you see? What does Puritanism do? What do Puritans do to allow this thing to emerge? Because capitalism, as you make clear, it doesn't just spring forth fully formed from the head of Zeus.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I could start the story there, actually, in England and in the Netherlands, where you have Calvinists, especially, who, I mean, they play a big role, at least in Weber's Protestant ethic. And I think this is the one part that, Weber really gets right. They it's bound up to some degree with the Calvinist Puritan belief in predestination, and how, if you don't know if you're one of the elect, this, as Weber says, this causes all kinds of anxiety about, oh my God, am I one of the elect or am I one of the damned? And one way that Puritan clerics and theologians are constantly telling their congregants is, one way to assuage that kind of anxiety is to say, you should really work hard. As Weber calls it, this worldly asceticism, right? You should work hard, save money, reinvest that money in your business, and that's a way to try to allay any kind of anxiety you may have about being one of the elect, or the damned. And obviously what this leads to is, Calvinists and Puritans piling up a lot of capital, because, here they are, they're told, make money, but don't you dare enjoy it. What you have to do is, plow it back into the business. And now, and one thing that I want to make clear was that in both Calvin's Geneva and in Puritan Salem, this accumulative ethos was encouraged, but it was also bridled, quite significantly, because there was still this Christian suspicion that, well, money has its attractions, and, it's good for you to work hard. And if you make a lot of money, that's probably a sign that you're one of the elect, but don't enjoy it too much, don't. So I think that in one way, that's how Puritans drive this process, by giving a certain kind of imprimatur to capital accumulation. And so what happens over time, right? I mean, as I show in the book, what happens over time is that, the money and the wealth, it's so good, it's so nice. And so God couldn't possibly mean that we can't enjoy it, right? So what happens over the course of about a century is that a lot of these older sorts of strictures on accumulation just gradually fade away, and you start to get this much more full bore kind of capitalism by the late 18th, early 19th centuries.
Yeah, you had this great line in there at some point. I mean, it's later on. We'll get to it in a bit. Where I think it was Rockefeller just said, "God gave me my money."
Yeah,
right? This phenomenal line in the.
Now Rockefeller, though, I mean, I don't know if this is where you wanted to go. I mean, but Rockefeller, I think, is in many ways he's sort of an updated version of the sort of evangelical Protestant sanctification of capitalism that you start to get in the early 19th century. The evangelicals are much more enthusiastic about market activity and capital accumulation than the Puritans ever were. The Puritans still had some kind of a sense that Mammon was a false god, and that as much as you might want to, as the phrase went, make friends with the unrighteous Mammon, right? The Puritans, I think, had a much keener sense than the evangelicals did that Mammon was unrighteous, right? And that you had to be very, very, very careful about consorting with that god. The evangelicals, man, they pull out all the stops. If you are successful, man, God has blessed you. There's just no doubt about it. I mean, part of this, I think, has to do with the fact that evangelicals are Arminians, which means that, they don't believe in this predestination stuff. It's in one way, it's a very liberating kind of idea, but in another way, it sort of, as I said, allows them to just go whole hog into market activity. I think evangelicalism, as I put it in the book, is enchantment for people on the make. It's very much a I still think it's a form of enchantment. A lot of people have written against this, at least my view of this, saying that, no, evangelicals were very strictly rational, they were very calculating and all this, and that's true, but I don't see how calculation and enchantment are mutually exclusive. They clearly saw capitalist enterprise as some of them even call it sacramental. A lot of their political economists do this. There are many people like Freeman Hunt is one guy I mentioned, who was the publisher of Hunt's Merchants Magazine, which was the first business journal in the United States. He's talking about the counting house as a sanctuary. You've got this self-help literature by people like Timothy Shea Arthur, which is very popular in the mid-19th century. Arthur is the author of this book whose title I just love, 10 Nights in a Bar Room and What I Saw There. But it's a classic of 19th century self-help literature. And he's writing these stories about how, spirits and angels and God comes to visit these young men who are in distress because they're unsuccessful. And he says to them, no, son, if you work hard, I'll help you and you become rich. And lo and behold, right, they become rich.
And you have this other, I won't make you talk about it, but you have this other stuff too. Like you describe Mormonism as like a prosperity gospel, and then Ralph Waldo Emerson, pretty arresting take on him as a kind of American Nietzsche, which I hadn't maybe thought about. So you have in the 19th century, so you have the story like, so Puritanism in your story, it sanctifies, the acquisition and reinvestment, and it provides a kind of legitimacy to these kind of burgeoning capital relations. There's a kind of deeper sanctification in the 19th century. And then in the mid to late 19th century, there is what you describe as a Copernican revolution. The corporation comes into being. And so there's the corporation, and then allied to it is the study of managing the corporation.
Yes.
And the emergence of not just management, scientific management, but also business schools, right, to do this. Notably, two presidents of the 20th century have advanced business degrees from Ivy League schools, right? So, the corporation, you don't have a lot of time for the corporation, right? So, and especially thinking about corporations.
You mean in terms of scholarly space or in terms of patience?
In terms of patience, right? So you have a lot of time for scholarly space, but patience not so much. And you really dislike the notion of thinking about corporations as persons. So I just wondered if you could talk to us about why you think the corporation is its emergence as a Copernican revolution, akin to that.
Well, okay. Yeah, in terms of both political and moral economy, I think it's a Copernican revolution in American business. First of all, because the standard enterprise throughout most of 18th and 19th century capitalism is the family proprietorship, or the small limited partnership. And for a variety of reasons, this gradually sort of shifts over the course of the 19th century to the business corporation as we know it, with limited liability for stockholders, and as you say, this new kind of understanding of it as a legal person, given jurisprudential legitimacy by the Santa Clara case and any number of later cases. So simply in terms of its institutional heft, the modern corporation represents this new kind of sun, right, around which everything's going to revolve. But also what it triggers, and I think this is the more important, in some ways, the more important aspect of the rise of the corporation, is that it really does trigger a lot of moral and cultural turbulence at the turn of the 20th century, because Americans are just unfamiliar with this kind of thing, or most of them are, because it's faceless, right? usually before the rise of the corporation, you knew the people who made your shoes or who made your food or something like this. Now with the corporation, the people who control your lives could be hundreds, if not thousands of miles away from you. So you've got this faceless entity that is controlling more and more aspects of your life. And a lot of writers were echoing this sentiment that the corporation was soulless, right? It not simply in the sense that it was doing awful things. If you were, say, a farmer in Oklahoma, who was in hock to the railroad, or something like this, but also, again, because it was faceless, and I couldn't tell, what is this thing? The person who's making my food used to be Mr. Smith. Now it's General Foods, Kellogg's. Like, what is that? So you start getting a lot of reflection on what this corporation is in a lot of different areas of American life. You get this at its highest levels. You get these articles by lawyers and legal scholars about, is the corporation a fetish? Is the corporation this kind of spiritual entity? How can it be both artificial and yet a person, right, at the same time? You get public relations departments of various corporations trying to basically create a corporate soul. This is, by the way, corporate soulfulness is not a creation of the 1990s. You see this kind of rhetoric in the 1890s, often in response to populist, capital P, populist criticisms of these soulless corporations. A lot of advertising and marketing in the early 20th century is basically about how to put a face and how to put a soul inside these new corporate entities. We're used now to talking about corporations, and we're used to their brands, which I think are actually sort of totems. Actually, if you're thinking anthropologically about these organizations. But Americans in the late 19th and early 20th centuries were really freaked out by this new entity. And I try to capture that in the book.
So business schools, I think there may be some people who are in who business majors maybe listening to this. What's the problem with business schools? Why doesn't Professor McCarraher like business schools? I mean, you're just jealous. They take.
I don't hate business students. Okay, I want to make that very clear. I love you all.
Yeah. Some of your best friends are business.
Some of my best friends are business. Right. Some of my best friends are economists. Believe me.
Exactly. Yeah.
What I do in the book is I try to explain the rise of business schools. I mean, you didn't have business schools before like 1880. The first business school was the Wharton School of Business, and right up the street from me in Philadelphia in 1883. And the interesting thing about business schools is that they didn't, at least at the time they were formed, whether it's Wharton or whether it's the Harvard Business School or what was it, the Chicago School, the one at the University of Chicago, whose name I can't recall right now. They made a point of saying, we are not just going to teach you about how to be successful in business, right? Joseph Wharton, the guy who, sponsored the opening of the Wharton School, said in the charter for Wharton that we want to produce a generation of what he called industrial statesmen, right? Pursuing industrial statesmanship. And what he meant by that was that he really did seem to believe that corporate business had some kind of a moral and cultural role to play in the country. And, we can differ about what we think that moral or cultural role is, right? But what strikes me is he felt it necessary to say that, right? And so I think that what business schools are about, at least at their inception, in this at this time when corporations are arising is that even business leaders themselves, people that I sometimes call the corporate intelligentsia or the corporate clerisy, really do feel that they have to take on some kind of a moral or some kind of a role of moral and cultural leadership, which it's easy for us 100 some years afterwards, to look at it and say, oh boy, was that a lot of hooey. I honestly don't think it was a lot of hooey. I mean, I think it's possible, particularly for left-wing historians, to be too cynical sometimes, and to not take seriously some of the aspirations that these guys had. Now, we may think that they didn't, those aspirations didn't turn out well, but I think they did have them, which, I do think speaks to, again, the conception of capitalism as being more than just a political economy, right? There's a moral and even a sacral economy here that these guys are trying to shape.
You could say, well, I mean, we'll talk about it in a bit, maybe, but even still have. I mean, what capitalism? You can joke about it, but there's a there. This isn't just a completely, cynical play on behalf of Twitter employees or Amazon or whoever it is. Right?
A lot of these business leaders, today, some of them I think are utter cynics and loons, but I think others. I'm not cynical about the fact that they have moral, even spiritual aspirations. I don't doubt that at all. What I question is what those moral and spiritual aspirations are. But the fact that they have them, I think, is telling.
Yeah.
And it seems to me that you're not really going to understand the creature. You're not going to understand the beast, until you grasp that.
No corporation. It's hard to think of a corporation we can think, now that says, what's your purpose? To make money, right? Full stop. Yeah, there has to be something else. So you have in the sort of late 19th and into the early 20th century, you have this really interesting stuff about people who say, hey, corporations, American capitalism is developing, bad idea. And you talk about American socialists and anarchists and the arts and crafts and capital P, populists. And one of the interesting things I found was you say that populists, this isn't an alternative to capitalism. They're not opposed to it. They just want to do it in a different way. And you seem to have, correct me if I'm wrong, you seem to have a lot of sympathy for anarchism and the arts and crafts movement. And so I guess I just have two questions. What are these people trying to do? What are the anarchists and arts and crafts movement trying to do? And it seems from reading that you think that there might be something that would be applicable today. And I just wonder what you that might look like.
Let me back a little bit and say a little bit about populists, because I know that that's a term that gets thrown around a lot these days. I think often very unreflectingly. So what I'm responding to in that part of the book partly is different kinds of historiography about populism over the last, I guess, 60 to 70 years. So as scholarship does, right, it goes through periods of fashion, right? Certain interpretations are fashionable, then they're not. Starting off with Richard Hofstadter in the 50s, Hofstadter basically thought populists were just a bunch of weed-chewing hicks, essentially. They were rubes who got caught up in the game, and basically they're just complaining about being losers. That's Hofstadter's take. Then in the 70s and 80s, you got scholars like Lawrence Goodwin and Christopher Lasch, who were arguing that no, populists were not rubes. Populists were in fact prophets, right? These guys saw this industrial modernity coming and they didn't like it and they were railing against it, right? And that was the reigning consensus when I was in grad school in the early 90s, that this is what the populists were about. Well, that fell, right? And so now you have what I think, what I've always thought was actually a pretty convincing interpretation of populist, which is like somewhere between Hofstadter and Goodwin Lash, where Charles Postel is probably the leading exponent of this view. And his argument is, look, populists were capitalists, right? I mean, they were usually small business people, small farmers, small shopkeepers, and they were not necessarily opposed to corporate modernization, right? They were not necessarily opposed to large-scale agriculture. And so what populism represented, it was an alternative form of capitalism, which was maybe, big government was there to support you. You might have, a sort of a rudimentary welfare state. The populists were among the first supporters of women's suffrage, right? And all of this. But it wasn't an alternative to capitalism, which is what I think Goodwin and Lash were trying to say. I don't buy that at all, which is why I think when you hear that term populist nowadays, I think people using it aren't using it in a very historically informed way, because it seems to me you've had right-wing and left-wing forms of populism. Left-wing populism, I would say today, is probably represented by somebody like Bernie Sanders. Even though he's called a socialist, I don't really think he's a socialist. I mean, I think he's a left populist or a social democrat or whatever. And right-wing populism, Trumpism, has a lot of these features. The reason that I like I like the anarchists and the arts and crafts folks, even though I would not classify myself as an anarchist. What I think the anarchists and the arts and crafts people were trying to do was act on and envision a kind of what I call in the book a capital R romantic opposition to capitalism, right? It's not Marxist in any way, in the sense that it sees, proletarianization and all this as positive features, right? Anarchists and arts and crafts folks don't see it that way. They're very much more like John Ruskin and William Morris and these other figures that I talk about earlier in the book, who actually wanted more direct workers' control of production, and not simply hand it over either to the state, or to this new class of professional managers and technocrats who were arising in the early 20th century. They were very much trying to, I think, preserve the values of craft and the values of artisanal labor on a new kind of technical basis. I don't think that they were backward looking in the sense that we often think of them. I know that sometimes arts and crafts folks are often characterized by historians as being reactionaries. I don't think that's right at all. I think what they were trying to do was something that was both very traditional, but also very progressive, which is to retain control over work and over technology in the hands of people who actually do the work, rather than divide it up according to managers and administrators and all of this. And yeah, I mean, that's why the anarchists and the arts and crafts people are, part of the, I guess what you could call the cavalcade of heroes and heroines in the book, right? As opposed to the villains.
Well, you make the point in the book that these people are asking the question: what is the effect on human beings of this particular kind of moral economy and political economy?
Which is a question, oddly enough, that Marx very seldom asks. Marx is clearly he's clearly opposed to the injustice and the misery of capitalism, but he thinks that capitalism is this necessary stage, right, through which we have to go in order to get to socialism and communism. And so that that would seem to entail this kind of, I mean, I think there's a kind of theodicy at work here, right, in Marx, where, you know, it's terrible and it's arduous and lots of people are going to be crushed by the wheel of progress, but, you know, damn it, we have to go through it because there's glory at the end. And anarchists and arts and crafts folks just didn't think that way.
So it's interesting. So somebody popped in a question here and said, okay, Gene, so how do you think how do you get to your arts and crafts post-capitalism? He asked. So he said, well, how do you overcome what might be a possible way to overcome the misenchantment of capitalism? And he points out, you know, Marx thought that socialist politics and the dictatorship of the proletariat would sort of be a midwife to socialism. And, you know, just a kind of how does your analysis basically play in the world in which we live? That's a neoliberal world.
Yeah. The short answer is I don't know. You know, well, I think it might play out in a number of ways. I mean, one is I do think that somehow we need to revitalize the labor movement. I don't think the labor movement is dead. I think it is very ill. I think it is dormant. But I do think that if we try to revitalize the labor movement, we have to I think we have to change the goals of the labor movement, which I think traditionally have been, at least in this country, an attempt to accommodate itself to capitalism. You know, you do have a history of much more radical labor unions like the IWW, you know, otherwise known as the Wobblies. But most American labor unions have been pretty accommodationist, right? I mean, their strategy, especially after the Second World War and the Great Depression, was, okay, here's the grand bargain. You guys can retain control over technology and production and administration. So we'll give up that. And so you just give us higher wages and better benefits and everything's going to be fine. Well, not everything turned out to be fine, because unless you strike at the basis of this, which is, right, you know, capital's control over the whole process, you're going to end up where we are now, right? I mean, which is disempowered and you know, pretty sickly in terms of its, you know, political strength. And so I think that I still think that the labor movement is key to this, but I think that we would have to radically change its goals to want control over the workplace, control over production technology. So that's one aspect. I'm very much, I think in the ecological movement, I think that romanticism has had an enormous impact on the ecological movement. You know, I think I demonstrated in my book that a lot of the modern thinking about ecology was influenced by a lot of these capital R romantic writers, which is why I think that if we're able to put something together coherent that we can call a Green New Deal, I think we can go a long way toward creating a more ecologically viable way of life. So I mean, I'm not optimistic, but I'm hopeful. And I think we just have to, you know, try to act in those venues where we have some kind of a window of opportunity in this regard.
Yeah. So the speculative part of these of the questioning, you make the suggestion that all forms of capitalism, political economy, moral economy, or enchanted neoliberalism, corporate capitalism, all the varieties that you offer. But surely, on your reading, then the alternative would have to be as well. So you've made this, you know, modern ecology clearly has this sort of enchanted history, or a history of thinking about enchantment. You trace that back to sort of the late 19th century, where people talk about Mother Earth, and
Right.
how does it look economically now, right? I mean, what is you say you need a revitalized political, sort of labor movement, and that's politics, fair enough. But what is the alternative enchanted vision, right, that you see to capitalism? What are the ways to foster it? I guess that's what I do. I suppose when I read the book, I thought, is Charles Taylor right? Right? Do we just live in the immanent frame with an impersonal moral order?
Well, yeah.
And is Weber right? That we're kind of stuck in this.
Well, here's the thing, though. I guess I read the end of Taylor's book a bit differently, because I think Taylor alludes at the end of that book to the idea that, a lot of people in modernity or post-modernity, or whatever you want to characterize our times, a lot of people are very, very disenchanted with disenchantment, right? I mean, they're very disgruntled with the way things are. And you can see this in some of the oddest forms, such as New Age spirituality, right? Which people like me, tend to just kind of roll our eyes, and laugh at this, or at least I used to, people talking about crystals and, listening to Enya and Celtic music, and all this. But then when you think about it, I mean, what is that? That's a hunger for sacramentality. It's a hunger for a sacramental way of being in the world. And so I don't think that I guess more orthodox religious believers should dismiss that. I think that's something that we should build on. I think it's something that we should engage with people. So I actually think that there's a great hunger out there for more enchanted or sacramental ways of being in the world. It's just that, I think with a lot of people, it's not taking the sort of standard Christian form, that it would have even, say, 50 or 60 years ago. And I guess, speaking as a Christian, I mean, I don't think we should run away from that. I mean, I think that's something that we should actually try to engage with.
Well, someone's asked if it's related to that, sacramentality, there's usually something physical, substantive about it, and a questioner says, well, look, what future do you see for arts and crafts or labor movement in a digital age, right? So it's basically within digital platforms rather than through physical consumers. And is there something that digital platforms offer?
I don't know, I say I don't know in a serious way. I mean, this is from the Department of Shameless Self-Promotion. I'm working on a short book right now about automation, and I'm asking myself exactly these kinds of questions, because on the one hand, I don't want to completely dismiss automation, because I do think there are lots of forms of labor that are either tedious or dangerous that clearly, if we could mechanize it, we should. I'm not dogmatic about that, right? I think that this is an area in which I think we need to appeal to, tech designers and engineers to try to develop ways in which we can combine digital technology and artificial intelligence with re-empowering workers to some degree. And it seems to me that that's, again, where the labor movement is key. Workers have to demand that they get the right and the knowledge back to themselves so that they can make decisions about this. I think that a lot of discussion about this, especially on the left, has gotten off track. It really has. You've got people on the left with these visions of automation that I think are just crazy. this kind of fully automated luxury communism. Like what, this one guy, Aaron Bastani, who he's got this big following in Britain now. Oh yeah, we're just going to go to the moon and we're going to go to these other places and we're just going to mine it for all the lithium, and all this. I think this is insane. I just think this is crazy. And it's a way, I think, of avoiding some really difficult questions. I think that a lot of sectors of the left right now are essentially, it's like they're outsourcing their political imaginations to Silicon Valley, and expecting the Zuckerbergs and the Musks of the world, to come up with the technology, and we're just going to inherit it. And I just don't think it's that simple. Number one, and number two, it seems to me, I keep going back to this. The most important question in this whole debate seems to me, who should make the decisions about the kinds of technology we want, right? I don't think we should simply assume that everybody's going to want digital technology. I don't think we think about the fact that so much of digitalization has been forced on us in the last 20 to 30 years. And we take it as though, oh, it's liberating. I would make the argument that in many ways it's not. And
email.
Yeah. So much of this the digital world has been forced on us. And I think we need to reclaim the political and imaginative space in which we can pose questions about this digital world. It's not to say that we totally do away with it, because that's not going to happen, number one. And number two, I don't think we should get rid of it, in toto. It seems to me that we just have to start slowing down and asking ourselves very important questions. And I think the one thing that of all the things that are going to force this issue upon us is impending ecological turbulence. Impending, it's already here, a lot of this, because I just don't see how you can keep a lot of these systems running and deal seriously with ecological crisis. That's a subject that I think is avoided quite often.
Do you see it as involving sort of, I want to say de-urbanization, but certainly maybe a move away from kinds. Well, one of the things sort of left is like, we're all going to live in cities soon, and we all need to sort of just cluster together, and that's the future, right? To think about small cities or small towns is like, investing in Betamax, as a friend of mine likes to say. Maybe it's that I live in a very small town, but is there something about the city and urban living that actually might empower corporations?
I think it could work either way. I think certainly you're right. It could end up empowering corporations even more. But I know I'm very much taken by some of the writing that Mike Davis has done on this lately. And his argument is that he thinks that, in fact, a different kind of urbanization is, in fact, part of the answer to ecological catastrophe, because it'll, greater density. His argument basically is that greater density of population allows for greater efficiencies in energy use, and I don't know. It's, I like cities, so I would like to see a greener city. I would like to see a greater division between city and country. I think that's a good thing.
Yeah, I was looking. One of the things I asked, that I was trying to go to ask the dismal scientists, what percentage do small businesses, defined as businesses that are independently owned and have fewer than 500 employees, what percentage of the economy or GDP is thought they produce? Somewhere around 44% now, which is down from the late 90s when it was right near 50%. So thinking where do those kinds of places exist. Let me, you've been patient. Let me get you out of here on this on a small question, which is, what's your vision of the good life, right? You have a long, detailed, persuasive analysis of how we got to where we are, and you've offered some potential ways out: a reinvigorated labor movement, thinking more about ecology, disempowering maybe, and disenchanting corporations. But what in the Eugene McCarraher, what would life be different, like in this capitalist paradise, the United States, if the McCarraher vision takes hold? What looks different?
So
in life in your neighborhood, for instance.
Is this where I'm announcing my candidacy for?
We're a nonpartisan institution.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, I'll say this. I think life would be slower. I think that people would not work as much as they do. I think that I tell my students this all the time. I think you guys work too damn much, and as much as you're told that is some kind of a badge of honor. I think that that's actually not good. I would love to destroy the Protestant work ethic. I think it's terrible. So I think people would have less work, but I think they would have better work, because it would be conducted under conditions that are more humane and more generous than they are. I would, like I said, I think life would be slower. I think it would be less work, more leisure to do things that we really want to do. And in fact, it would be a world in which maybe the distinction between work and play was less rigid than we think it is. One thing I've been thinking about lately is this distinction that Marx makes between the realm of necessity and the realm of freedom. And I think that Marx makes much too rigid a distinction between these two things. I think that play, freedom, and necessity have always been bound up together, and they always will be, right? I mean, when we talk about food as the realm of necessity, well, food is also the realm of cuisine. Food is also, clothing is the realm of necessity, but fashion and adornment is the realm of freedom. So it seems to me it would be a world where we realize that these distinctions aren't at all rigid, that these two dimensions always interpenetrate. And I think that would give us at least a somewhat happier and more humane and more generous world if we thought this way.
Yeah, I think one of the messages that comes through from your book is that you're not an ascetic. You're not arguing for a kind of new asceticism, just a different relation to a different, richer, more enchanted relation to the material world.
Yeah, matter is good. I mean, matter is good. Flesh is good. Pleasure and delight and joy are good things. This is one of the reasons that, as I say early in the book, I really am sick of hearing about consumerism, because not that I think consumer culture is a great thing, but what I think a lot of anti-consumerism rhetoric ends up doing is, fostering precisely this kind of asceticism that you're talking about. We're material beings, right? So, doing things with matter and enjoying matter is just part of who we are. I'm not talking about consumerism as a way of not talking about capitalism. I think.
Yeah.
And so I think that's where the focus needs to be.
Yeah. Well, your book does talk about capitalism. It's been a pleasure and a joy to be able to talk with you tonight, and we appreciate you giving us your time.
Thanks. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, for those of you who are listening tonight, our next event is on the 25th of March, when Elizabeth Lash Quinn, daughter of Christopher Lash, who Gene mentioned, will be here to talk about her new book, Ars Vitae.